Okay, hello. My name's Lee Wallace, and I'm the director of the Sydney. I'd like to acknowledge that we're all here tonight and on Gadigal land, and the rain has been falling all day on Gadigal land. So I thank you especially for staying around for this what I think is going to be a fantastic event, and thank you for those of you joining us on the webinar tonight. So I've only recently met Professor Terry Flew. He's quite a recent addition to the University of Sydney, but I've had the pleasure of watching him lead an extraordinary session today that began early this morning and has only just recently finished. So he has energy tonight to talk to us about the backlash, the techlash, but I can also tell you that our experience of setting this room up has proven to me that the tech is also lashing back. So hopefully everything will be going well. We've got somebody here, and we've got Nanda Giroz, who has COVID and can't be with us tonight. She's organising the webinar from home. So thank you, and Terry. But Terry's the MC tonight is Terry's colleague in MECO, Media and Communications here, Professor Catharine Lumby. So Catharine, I'll hand it to you.
Thank you, Lee. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for coming out in this interesting weather. And I echo what Lee said about acknowledging country, which is incredibly important, land that was never ceded, which we are honoured to be on. Let me just say this about Terry. Terry and I were hired together almost as a package deal. We've known each other for well over 2 decades. I am a huge admirer of Terry's work. I have learned so much from him over a very long period of time. I've read pretty much everything Terry's written and cited it in my own work, such as my own work is. Terry is nationally and internationally renowned scholar, but above and beyond that, he is, and this matters to me, he's someone who cares about public impact with ideas. He's not someone who polishes ideas to shine them on a shelf or simply to imbue himself with status. He's someone who is passionate about making a difference in the world. And it's one of the things that I feel I have strongly in common with Terry. He's also a really good bloke who I love working with. And I read his book, and I can say this hand on heart, in one sitting. And one of the things about Terry's book, and it will probably be said in the actual formal launch, is that Terry is someone who works with sophisticated concepts but communicates them with great clarity and does it with a form of engagement. And there's I wouldn't call Terry a passionate person. I'm probably more of an extroverted person. But what comes through, what shines through in the way he conjures with ideas is his deep commitment to ideas and to making a difference in the world. And the subject we're going to talk about tonight could sound very wonky and nerdy. And one of my first degrees was in law, so I do have my nerdy side. And Terry and I have worked on media content regulation, and both of us influencing each other's work for a number of decades. And this book is, I'll just hold it up so that people in the webinar can see, Regulating Platforms. As I said, the book I read in literally a day is incredible. It really brings together pretty much everything I could imagine that you could say about the questions of regulation. And we're going to dig into that on the panel. And I'll talk about the wonderful panellists we have here tonight soon. But with that said, Terry, we're excited about this book and we're excited about the ideas in it. So thank you for writing it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine, for that most generous introduction, and thank you to Lee and to Nanda for bringing this event together. It's very exciting to have an in-person book launch. We take certain things for granted. We used to take certain things for granted. Okay, after a long period where it was assumed that the internet and digital platforms would be largely free of government regulation, there's been a sharp turn in recent years towards debates about regulation of digital platforms. the rise of online misinformation and fake news, concerns about online harms to vulnerable people, public figures being defamed online, the dominance of a few corporations over key digital economy markets, and scandals about the misuse of personal data have all been factors triggering a wave of public inquiries and new forms of legislation governing online media in different parts of the world. And it's been estimated that there are now over 100 such public inquiries into the conduct of digital platforms taking place around the world. Whereas once there was a view that there was a distinction between so-called authoritarian states that sought to regulate the internet and liberal democracies which didn't, the range of such inquiries and new legislation has in fact been most prominent. In Australia, we could talk, for instance, about the new News Media and Digital Platforms Bargaining Code, the Online Safety Act, and the wonderfully named Social Media Anti-Trolling. While the merits of individual pieces of legislation can be debated, the wider context that supports governments doing something about the perceived power of digital platforms and the need for platform power to be exercised responsibly is widespread, and I'd suggest to a significant degree now politically bipartisan. Earlier assumptions that government laws would break the internet or that national regulations were ineffective in dealing with global platforms have given way to calls for nation states to act as a countervailing force with the sovereign capacity to govern the conduct of such platforms. And this turn towards regulation is, as I see it, a consequence of what can be termed the platformisation of the internet, by which I now mean that virtually all digital interactions are now mediated through a relatively small number of digital platforms. The companies that own and operate these platforms are giant conglomerates operating in multiple markets around the world, with business models based around the gathering of data from many sources, which is then used to guide decision-making based on perceived behavioural factors, and corporate cultures that emphasise disruptive innovation. And I've put up on the screen here an image from the site Visual Capitalist, which talks about the world's most valuable brands. Now, it doesn't matter if you can't read it, because the key dots to note are in the middle. And we look at that, all of those seven companies there are platform companies. So we have Amazon, Apple, Google, Microsoft, Facebook at 6, and Tencent and Alibaba at 5 and 7. 20 years ago, only Apple and Microsoft would have featured on such a list. And I think the other thing that's apparent there, which would be a different conversation, is the rise of Chinese brands. The rise of these digital platform giants has drawn attention not only to their economic power and influence, capacity to convert that into political power, but also what I talk about in the book as communications power. Digital platform companies increasingly find themselves the new gatekeepers of public speech, converting the governance of speech and media content from a relationship between governments and content distributors of the sort that Catharine and I were studying, and all those debates about censorship and classification and so on, to what Jack Balkin has now termed a free speech triangle, where platform giants increasingly set their own rules as to what is distributed through their platforms and on what terms. Perhaps not surprisingly, the arguments of platform companies towards this have turned from claims that they cannot be regulated or that they shouldn't be regulated, although we sometimes hear that, to claims that they should be regulated, but not necessarily by governments. Mark Zuckerberg observed to the US Congress in 2018 that, quote, "The real question as the internet becomes more important in people's lives is what is the right regulation, not whether there should be or not. So quasi-third-party regulatory entities, such as the Facebook Oversight Board, have been developed so as to distance content moderation decisions from Meta, the company itself, but also as an alternative judicial platform to that provided historically by governments, regulators and courts. Whether companies can be relied upon to exercise responsible stewardship over online civic discourse is, of course, an open question. The testimony of whistleblowers such as former Facebook data scientist Frances Haugen, or the various statements of former tech company executives in documentaries such as The Great Hack or The Social Dilemma, clearly provide pause for thought. But the question turns on more than whether we can trust giant companies to do the right thing or engage in what the management theorist Carl Rhodes has recently termed woke capitalism. It also turns on questions of sovereignty and who can and should exercise stewardship over the online space. Global platform companies claim they're uniquely placed to do this. And in one of my favourite quotes in the book, former Google CEO Eric Schmidt observed that, quote, high tech runs 3 times faster than normal business, and the government runs 3 times slower than normal business. So what you want to do now is to make sure the government doesn't get in the way and slow down. From this perspective, the companies themselves have become the new sovereign. And the best thing, if you accept Schmidt's argument, would be for governments and citizens to get out of the way and enjoy the bounteous innovations that they promise. Not surprisingly, many internet activists and civil society organisations reject this corporatist vision of internet, but they also have concerns about governments blocking the open internet for both well-intentioned as well as ill-intentioned reasons. So there's thus talk about digital constitutionalism or a global set of rules for the internet that could be grounded in human rights law and be overseen by NGOs. I have reservations about this, that I think for all the good intentions, and these are people, such NGO-led solutions can lack democratic accountability. Now, note here the late Tony Benn, the champion of the British democratic left, who would tour the country putting up, usually on blackboards, that was Tony Benn's era, 5 questions about power. And they were, what power have you got? Where did you get it from? In whose interest do you use it? To whom are you accountable? And how do we get rid of you? And as the last one, that's the telling one, I think, that for all of their apparent flaws, it is governments that have this accountability and legitimacy. We can get rid of them. While regulation by experts or legitimation by scientific standards or international law are appealing, removal of decisions about how best to govern the internet and digital platforms should not be cordoned off from democratic deliberation. We look to governments to regulate other key economic sectors, such as banking and finance, even though they are complex global fields. And it's both responsible, reasonable and appropriate that we should be looking to governments to regulate the conduct and performance of digital platforms to better align these to the public interest. If governments and regulatory agencies are to play such roles, they will need to become as sophisticated in their operations as the digital platform companies themselves. The legal scholar Julie Cohen has proposed that after decades of what former Trump advisor Steve Bannon termed deconstructing the administrative state, he also coined the phrase flood the zone with shit. It's time, I believe, to reassert the capacity of regulators to be responsive. And one notes in Australia evidence of this, former ACCC Chair Rod Sims's role in getting issues related to the power of Google and Facebook onto the public agenda, or Julie Inman-Grant's stewardship of the Office of the E-Safety Commissioner in enabling online users to feel more empowered in their dealings with around issues such as cyberbullying. So I think what will be required over time will be joined up policy thinking. Too often, laws to regulate digital platforms can appear in an ad hoc manner, consuming considerable energy in pursuit of uncertain policy goals that need to be seen to be doing something. What has been termed neo-regulation, that Philip Schlesinger has termed neo-regulation, will, I think, become increasingly important, where agencies that engage with different aspects of digital platform structures and conduct, be they anti-competitive practices, online harms, ethical uses of artificial intelligence, misinformation, etc., will need to collaborate at both the national level and build and share knowledge and alliances at an international level. So in other words, joined up digital platform regulation will require regulators who are able to think like Google. At the same time, they'll be required to think about regulation in pursuit of public interest goals that can address the economic, political and communications power of digital platforms, which will at times require them to be prepared to take on Google and other such corporate giants. There is now much at stake in democratic societies in demonstrating the capacity to do the two things, joined up thinking and acting in the public interest at once. If Australia can be a leader in that, it will have made a major contribution to global debates about digital platform regulation and the future of internet governance.
Terry, a lot of food for thought. That was amazing. And again, I urge you to get this book because it really is crystal clear summation of a whole range of issues that many of us in this room and audience and in the webinar, hello people, virtual people, we know you're there, and we'll be, I'll be looking at your questions when we get to question time. What we're going to do now in running order is spend about 30 minutes where just to, so everyone knows where we're headed, as it were. So we're going to go through to about 10 to 7, and that will include the panel responses, but we'll also have room for Q&A, including people who are joining us remotely. And then Anika will be launching the book. So I'm going to introduce our amazing panel. So obviously Terry, who you've met, but I'll just say very briefly, Terry is the Professor of Digital Communication and Culture at the University of Sydney, and he's the author of 14 books, count, including the book we are here to celebrate tonight, Regulating Platforms, published by Polity. He has advised companies including Facebook, Cisco Systems and SBS, and government agencies and internationally, and ACMA and a range of things. Not things, organisations that are very prestigious. And he's held numerous distinguished visiting professor roles. Ayesha, who is has an equally shiny kind of resume, even though you're a postdoctoral fellow. I've been looking at your work. It's quite amazing. In the Centre for Media Transition at UTS. Her current research very usefully focuses on peace and conflict ethics and justice and digital media cultures. She's also worked as a journalist in Afghanistan, Australia, Germany, and Pakistan for several media organisations, including the Express Tribune, partners with the International New York Times, Deutsche Welle, and SBS News Radio. And finally, Peter Lewis. Peter is, well, a friend of mine, which speaks well of him. He's one of Australia's leading public campaigners and commentators. He is the principal of Essential Media, which in my view is the very, very best top-notch research company in Australia, and has been behind some of Australia's most successful and innovative campaigns, including Every Australian Counts for the NDIS and Never Alone of the Luke Batty Foundation. He oversees the fortnightly Essential Report, which is essential reading, and is a regular columnist for The Guardian Australia. So I'm going to kick off with Terry. I'm going to throw questions to panellists, but other people can, you guys can just jump in and iterate.
Should they have responses first?
Oh, well, I think we talked about just throwing straight to discussion, but we can. Would you like?
Yeah, sure. You've
Okay.
got a response.
Yes, sorry. It's just weird.
I just got the dog ears here. You go first.
Okay, I'll just keep it at
That's okay, because we'll probably come to some of these comments in the questions anyway. Yeah, but go ahead, Ayesha.
First, I really want to thank Terry. It couldn't have come at the right time. It couldn't have come at a better time, a time of rapid digital transformation, both in our public and private lives. Digital platforms are pretty much, our lives are revolving around it, but they have also changed the rules of ordinary lives. But at the same time, they've also served as disruptors to traditional media, to democracy, to creative industries, populism, human rights, society at large, you name it, and there has been a disruption. Which is, of course, adding complexities to how the stakeholders navigate it. What personally really fascinates me about this book is how Terry has dealt with the issue of power, because as an academic who has really a lot of interest in justice and power issues, this really spoke to me. Also, as Catharine mentioned, with such with the language that basically speaks to everyone, including people who are not native English speakers like myself. So I just have a few notes. I'll be very quick, but and I'll read through them. So as platforms gave more power to certain individuals and corporations, they've also shifted much of its share to the public in the form of nudging or e-nudging, developing grounds for Techlash, which we are here for. And I wouldn't read from this section that I've highlighted. But more specifically, chapters 3 and chapter 4 really spoke to me the most, because they highlight the unlimited power that these platforms have and their CEOs have over these sites, and the reasons that led to Techlash becoming an important phenomenon and wide areas of matters of public concern, most leading to issues such as trust, freedom, ethics, or the lack of thereof. And what really also speaks to me is how it has impacted traditional journalism and the quality of journalism. So digital platforms have not only impacted traditional journalism, it has also created new challenges to mainstream journalistic quality. And we at the Center for Media Transition also has a 175-page report on how it has impacted journalistic content. And this book also appropriately highlights this concern in chapter 3, which is also a concern for me, because I've also made this transition from mainstream media into digital journalism, and how everything has changed from education to how it's taken in. But at the same time, yeah.
Wait, take your time.
I think I'm really going fast. Yeah.
No. I'm saying, we don't even have to get to the questions I've got for the panel if you want to be more expansive.
Yeah, sure. All right. Thank you. But what really also speaks to me is the rise of authoritarian internet. I come from Pakistan originally, and in Pakistan, countries like Pakistan are primarily missing from the mainstream debate because they have on paper a democracy. But in actuality, it is it's an authoritarian style democracy, which has a lot of control in the hands of the military establishment in Pakistan, which of course also affects how censorship of media content works, censorship of individuals work, access to technology and digital platforms work as well. Some of you might not know that, yes, even Pakistan, a democracy, has had issues of censorship, such as there was a ban on TikTok, there were patches of bans on YouTube. Every time there is some political event, internet is disabled and there is no access to technology or the telecommunications. And we're talking about a rather developing country, so to say, with lots to add to the political and strategic input around that in the world as well, in that region of the world, especially in relations with China and India and Iran, and most recently Afghanistan. So I think when I first picked this book, I looked at, there's a chapter dedicated to Chinese platforms, and I was like, oh, okay, there's a focus on China. But of course, a little bit of my bias came up, and I said, who's going to talk about Pakistan? Who's going to talk about Afghanistan and India? But it really makes sense because, as Terry also mentioned, how Chinese platforms are really emerging as very important platforms of technology. This serves as a case to study for people from countries where there is a problem, but it's missing from the debate. So I'm going to read a few points that I wrote here, is that platforms are centered around human experience, but people's experiences of digital platforms and the internet as a whole are not uniform globally. One of the phenomena that has greatly impacted and shaped human experience is the rise of authoritarian internet, a way governments control their citizens through technology. And the discussion is incomplete without mentioning how China has reinvented authoritarianism for digital age. And this also, of course, really changes the debate on policy, democracy, freedom, and of course, governance and regulation. And lastly, my response on the book is that the 3 I's that are the main elements and the building blocks of this book, interests, ideas, and institutions, intersect to shape social reality. And most importantly, the way we experience this reality, the way we understand this reality, and the way we accept this reality as parts of our lives through first-hand use or through implications of policy and policymakers, and most importantly, how we become part of the sharing economy. Thank you. That's all.
Thank you, Ayesha. That's wonderful. And can I say, yeah, Ayesha, thank you very much. And can I say that one of the things I think is very valuable about your contribution, like me, you were a journalist. I was a journalist, a print and TV journalist for a long time. And I think coming to this book with that background and then the challenges that we both know about the transition, the media transition, Derek Wilding sitting there, and this is where you work in this centre. It brings, I think, well, I would say this self-servingly, it brings a different dimension to, and Peter's a former journalist, a different dimension to looking at this question of distribution of knowledge, who gets to gatekeep, all of these important questions. Now, Pete, I'd say this, we're nearly at 6:30, so either you can talk now and we can skip questions and go straight to Q&A at 22, and I'm happy to do that, or would you prefer just to kind of do a response?
Well, I've got a little perspective that I'd like to share that might be about what this book means to me. So I don't want to get into competition with you, Catherine, but I think I first met Terry maybe 35 years ago on Manning Bar. And I was a very poor student who ended up getting on the ticket to run Honi Soir and falling in love with the sound of my own voice and going off into the media and walking away from academia. And seriously, I worked in media and set up my own research company. But the next time I was in a university, I kid you not, was about 5 years ago when Catharine and I were asked to do a review, Monash Uni's Masters of Comms, and I had not been near a uni for 30 years. So I have worked in public communications and research, and I've been someone that totally embraced the use of platforms to run political campaigns. And I kind of had this pivotal moment about 4 years ago when I did what every 50-year-old bloke does and pitches his memoir. And I pitched it up to Uni of New South Wales Press as a book about Gen X, because that's the only area where I'm a minority group, so I can sort of see the world that way. And I ended up writing a book about technology. And it was basically just what's happened to us sort of book. And I felt real concerns about the way that technology was affecting my kids, was affecting public discourse, and just had a big rant. And then I picked up almost just as it came out, Zuboff put out her book, Surveillance Capitalism, and I found it really affirming that someone had put an intellectual scaffold around what I felt. And it motivated me to stay on this issue. And from there, I worked with the Australia Institute, which is a progressive think tank to Centre for Responsible Technology, which wasn't on the bio that somebody emailed through to Catherine. So I also run that as kind of a passion project. And the work we've done with the Centre for Responsible Technology over the last couple of years with the Australia Institute has really been support regulation. So, you know, bunch of lefties, regulation good, non-regulation bad, sort of bump up against a lot of the traditional first wave internet people that see freedom as being the promise of the internet. And as I've got deeper and deeper into the issue, you realise that regulation is everywhere. That discussion we had today, 100 different reviews. And it's kind of worried me that you end up playing whack-a-mole. We leaned in really heavily behind the ACCC platform inquiry to the extent that I did what I thought I would never do and worked inside track with a Liberal government to get their legislation through, because I thought that that regulation of media was a positive step. I thought the whole package should have gone through, but that's the only bit that's made it. But the broader sense was that I thought regulation was good. But over the last couple of years, the Libs keep rolling out, regulate this, regulate that. There's another panic. The anti-trolling is a classic case. Oh, they're trolling. We need to regulate it. And so the point is, it was only when I read this book over the last couple of weeks, and there's a scaffold for understanding where my concern is, which is Terry nails governance. And it's not just about like this book should actually be called Governing Platforms, not Regulating Platforms. And it's the governing bit which I think is far more ambitious and far more interesting. So again, I put another book out at the end of last year called The Public Square Project, a bunch of essays that various people contributed to, but it's basically saying we've actually got to build civic we've got civic digital institutions. And again, this I feel is a bit of a roadmap for getting there. So I want to thank you, Terry, because I feel that your academic work has given me a framework for my advocacy work and my business. I didn't have, and I think going back to our original thing, when we started off on Manning Bar 30 years ago, you went down the academic path, I went down another path, but without the academy to provide that scaffolding, the journey would not have a roadmap. So that would be my contribution and my reflection on this book.
Thanks, Pete. And why wasn't I invited to the Manning Bar? I was around on camp. I'm just feeling a little miffed here, guys. Okay.
One of my ex-lecturers is up the back there too, and we won't
Rod,
talk about what he
g'day,
used to
Rod.
wear.
A friend of all of us.
Hey? We won't talk about his wardrobe back then. Yeah.
I'm going to call it out. Safari suits were involved. Anyway, let us move on from these traumatic memories, people. So we don't have a lot of time because I'll probably have 5 minutes for Q&A. So, because, we've got a little packed schedule here with amazing panel. So, but I'm going to ask Terry a question. I'm going to kick it off and then I'm going to throw to Peter and then to Ayesha. Terry, one of the things that interests me, and we're both sort of a bit policy wonky on governance, is a long time ago, and I'm sure you've read this report. I think you brought Kate and I in to, as my memory serves me well, to consult when you were working with the Australian Law Reform Commission on media content regulation. And so Kate Crawford, who's now a superstar US professor, and she and I, now cue hissing here, did a number of large reports for Google. Come on, you're free, you can hiss. But they didn't put their fingerprints on them. And one of the ones, we produced a big report called The Adaptive Moment. And it was looking at a big picture approach to governance. And this is just post-platformisation, which Terry talks about. The move from the libertarian internet that many of you here will remember, where it was all utopian discourse about democratisation and all of these things that we all thought, and the Communications Decency Act in the US, Section 230, which said they're not publishers, they're just pipes and wires. It's kind of, there was a whole lot of that discourse. I was a cheerleader for it, I've got to say. Revise some of those views now. And we looked at the stakeholders in governance in the Australian context. Now, in a federal system where you've got the federal government and the state governments, that's one thing in terms of classification and governance of media content. And of course, the common law plays a role here. But if you look at it broadly, there's three stakeholders. There's government, there's industry, and government and industry work in the self-regulation, co-regulation and full regulation space. And then the stakeholders that we saw as somewhat novel that really came to the fore were what we call digital citizens. That is, people who are media users and producers. So in the context of a more libertarian understanding of the online media space, just post-early platformisation, I want to know, Terry, what do you see the role as these, what we call digital citizens as? Is this still a useful term to conjure with?
Thanks for that great question. I think first thing I just wanted to note was the term governance has come up a couple of times, and I did actually think of calling this book Governance Platforms and went back and forth a few times on that. The view was that regulation was a term that was better understood, but I think all platforms govern at some level. In fact, it's inherent to being a platform. As far as the digital citizens question goes, I think it can go down one of two paths. One of which is advocacy and the role played by different NGOs in this space that I think ultimately causes to stick, they invariably have to take some sort of organisational form. So I think that that's one path in which digital citizens can go. The other is a kind of tech-mediated populism. And we had a very interesting instance of that this week with Elon Musk buying a 9% share of Twitter. And he polled his 8 million might be more, it might be 80 million, it's a lot, followers on Twitter's attitude to free speech, and said, this poll will matter. And he did this before he announced his takeover. So you can get that kind of tech-mediated populism is another way that things can go, and you can get into a general discussion there about populism, but populism gives the appearance of public empowerment, but not the substance of it. So I think there's two possible pathways there with the digital citizenship.
Thanks, Terry. So I'm going to throw to Peter, and then Ayesha, I'm going to come to you, because Ayesha, I'm particularly interested to talk to you a little bit about the question of hate speech and you know, I guess the focus that, just to prepare you, the focus that is always kind of white, Anglo, Western, democratic concerns of the worried well. And I really want to draw you out on that. But Peter, you know, the book of your book, Webtopia, which I launched, by the way,
Wrote the,
not at Manning Bar.
you wrote the blurb on the front.
Thank you. I get kudos now. It's a joke. Right. But I'd like you to unpack that a little bit. Like, many of us used to be supremely positive, utopian. Terry talks about this very eloquently in his book. And now we have this kind of dystopian narrative. And, you know, I've been doing a lot of work, horrible to put your head in, on online violent extremist material, working with security studies people. We published a book last year on this. So there's some pretty disturbing stuff out there. And I mean, it feels to me like we're yo-yoing between a utopian and a dystopian, you know, the democratization argument and then, you know, we've all gone to hell in a handbasket argument. I mean, what would you say to kind of talk about how we think about risks and dangers? And
So bouncing off Terry's idea, like, remember the idea of the netizen? It was the big thing. It was that you would be a citizen of the internet, and you know, you would be active in discussion boards, and you would find your tribes, and you would collaborate. And I think I don't want to talk about my book because I'm kind of embarrassed about it, because it was just a set of fields, but it's led me on this journey. But I think where we've ended up at the platformisation is actually from netizen to consumer. And the question is, where do we go next? And so much of our civic life at the moment is anchored in these platforms that view us as consumers, and to the extent that the algorithms are using every interaction. So a couple of examples. The ABC now, if you want to comment on a show, they don't have their own communities. They outsource it all to Facebook. If you want to go in, my wife is very active in the community, and she wanted to take part in a consultation with the Department of Transport. You need a Facebook account and to register through Facebook to ask a question of your government. Now, surely that is not the appropriate place for us to be living a civic life. So I put up the straw man of ABC as social network. We're never going to get there. But the idea of something that exists without the surveillance capitalism models, that we can, like a civic version of LinkedIn maybe, where we can access both, participate as citizens, participate in civil society, and engage in our government without the tools that monitor and shape our behaviour. So that's a design challenge as much as a political challenge, and it's not beyond our capability, particularly if we adopt Terry's framework of thinking about how we're going to govern this place. But I do think there is a role for, and you know, the platforms create their own behaviour. You look at the difference in the way people act when they're on LinkedIn, when they've got their suit and tie on, and when they're on Twitter, but like they're totally different ecosystems because of the different norms and rules. Surely we can create a civic space that's different. I'm sorry about that mind image, but who doesn't use Twitter on the toilet? Show your hands if you don't, you know. Yeah.
is there any end to it, Ayesha? So this is my question to you. I have many questions for you, many of which I will annoy you with afterwards. But I mean, there's a lot of talk, right, about regulating big tech. Where I want to draw you out, and I don't want to make you, you know, the non-Anglo person in the room, because that's like so not what I want to do. But you are very knowledgeable because of all the places you've worked as a journalist and because of the work you've done on, you know, war and peace, conflict. I mean, how relevant is that today, by the way? The work you're doing, very important work. Unfortunately, it is. And it's, you know, Ukraine's in all our hearts at the moment. So I wanted to ask you about I guess my question, if I can wrap it up, is sort of like there's a very westernized focus to the way we think about platformisation, the issues that we confront. I mean, I've got one of my wonderful PhD students, Hayley, sitting in the audience, who works on Chinese social media. And, you know, it is brought home to me all the time that there's this sort of westernized focus on regulation. I mean, and the Western kind of focus often says, oh, look, autocratic states like Russia and China, and they're sort of dismissed. I mean, can you talk in broader terms about, are there different issues in different parts of the world, and what irritates you, or what do you see that's not being spoken about in the governance space?
Thank you. Yeah, I could go on all night on that, but my area before I came to Australia, my main area of focus was Afghanistan and Pakistan and India. So this area, the South Asia, basically, because also they have a shared, more or less shared culture, languages, religion as well. I'll speak for that part of the world, which is also a victim of what Terry also mentioned in his book, The Splinter Net. So not everyone has experience, as I mentioned in my response, internet or the experience of being on social media platforms in a uniform manner. If I specifically talk about Pakistan, the users are, just as in the United States, heavily polarized. There is so much polarization on social media. You come to social media and you look at the matter and you look at the narrative, and it's completely different from when you go on the field and talk to people. So what worries me is that what's happening and what narrative is being put out to the world on social media is actually not the real case, what's happening there on the ground. And it's also because some of the political factions have more access to internet or technologies, or are from more educated. I'm more educated as in, what I'm not trying to put a line here, but what I'm trying to say is they have more access to internet and technologies and have less language barriers as well. There is a lot of problem online and offline, but I'm only going to be talking about online. And also the problems are intersectional. When you come to South Asian countries specifically, there are problems that emerge on grounds of religion, on gender, on culture. Blasphemy law, for most importantly, people are unquestionably killed on sight, burned on sight. And I'm sorry to trigger anyone here for posting wrong things on the internet, wrong in the eyes of the state. Pakistani, for example, the cybercrime law is one of the most draconian laws that I ever have. And it's, while on paper, as most of the times in authoritarian states or authoritarian style states, it is meant to save the public, but it's actually there to protect the establishment and the state, which is backed by the establishment. So there's no freedom of speech. Hate is intersectional. It's focused on through gender, through religious beliefs. I recently wrote a piece for The Guardian about the deafening silence of international media on the Afghan war, and how everyone is jumping on the bandwagon and forgetting the rest because of the attention economy, the issue of attention economy as well, and people are just moving along. And then I received hate. I received rape threats, which I know I'm in a safe place. I'm safe from them, but it was very overwhelming. So you can't even begin to imagine what people, and that also, of course, pushes them into the spiral of silence. And that's why there's such a disparity between what is happening on the ground and what is happening on, or which is reflected online. And lastly, to put it, that I think that's, I'm also exploring more research opportunities into looking at redefining this kind of work for network spaces, especially in countries that are missing from the academic debate. So trying to put in my pitch in it and a contribution to the global debate. And my PhD thesis was also about de-westernizing how war is reported by international media. So let's see. That's all I have to say.
Well, it's fantastic work and it's really interesting. And I think it just sort of behoves all of us to recognise how I'm probably not saying anything that anyone in this room doesn't think, but how westernized these debates are and how insular. And I'm sort of going to sum up a little bit now before we go to Q&A for a few minutes. I think one of the things that really stood out for me in Terry's book was his discussion of how, if we went back, say, 10 years, there was a lot of discussion about global fora. And I certainly was someone who thought that, the only way we're going to solve some of these regulatory governance problems is to look at international fora and so forth. And what we've seen politically and culturally and socially on many levels is a surprising return to the nation state, when all we were talking about was globalism, probably from, an Anglo perspective, in very heedless, westernized ways, in ways that were very ignorant of the specific circumstances of different peoples, cultures, nations. But we have seen a return even in the US and in Australia and the UK and in the EU. So it reminds us the arc of history is not teleological. In other words, we're not on a progress to some golden era, but we're all, I think, well, at least me as a human, are inclined to think we are. It's a sort of default setting. And so I think it's one of the things Terry talks about and really maps in his book, that what we thought is we need to look at where we are, not where we thought we were. I think he articulates that brilliantly. And I think one of the other things that Terry does in summation is, which maybe this is generational, Terry, but you describe beautifully what you call the libertarian era of the internet, call it utopian. From 1990, we lived this, right, until the rise of platformisation in the mid 2000s, right? And I think Terry and I were both cheerleaders for that, like
And Peter.
and Peter, and you. How old were you?
Maybe a teenager, but I still have stories to tell myself. They're very fascinating.
It's been,
Just at my experience that.
yeah, you're on the verge of it, right? And so it's that, that moment where, we really did think it was going to be a game changer, and everything. The sun had come up, and we're all going to sunbake in the glow of the internet. And then I think that, the focus now is far more often on the way the platformed internet enables malevolent actors to spread horrific hate speech, division and disinformation. And I guess that, like, anyone who thinks and reads Terry's book, for instance, will know that or be suspicious of dystopian or utopian narratives, that the truth lies in the cracks. That's where we find reality, and we need to pay attention to things beyond Western concerns as well. And with that said, final thing I'll say is, a hobby of mine, a very amateur hobby, is trying to trick algorithms. And I'm very pleased to say I've been receiving advertisements on Facebook for penis enlargement. So clearly my evil plan is working. Maybe I have an imaginary penis, I don't know. I hope I haven't triggered anyone here. So with that, I'm going to ask if there are any questions. We've got about 5 minutes before we go to the launch of this amazing book. Questions? And I'm going to go up and look. Oh, thanks. Come on, someone's got a question. There we go.
Okay, easy. I'm really looking forward to reading this book. Governing and regulating platforms is something I struggle with all the time in my own work. But I guess my question builds on that final discussion about global, and the reintroduction of the nation state, is that with platformization, we're all publishers now, but we also all travel the globe through the internet. So how do we manage regulation when we're in one country publishing content or working on platforms? The platform is owned in a separate country, and perhaps readers, or like in the case of Upwork and Fiverr, perhaps clients and employers are hiring people from different countries. How do we manage that sort of global regulation is sort of my question.
Okay, I'm going to take that in two parts. One is around the globalism or otherwise of the internet. I think we're in early days of studies into this, but I think we shouldn't overestimate the extent to which our online consumption remains nationally and particularly culturally shaped. So I had a doctoral student at QUT who looked at different generations of Chinese diaspora in Australia and how they use Chinese digital platforms and how they use Western digital platforms, and the dynamics are very different. So I think it's like if you look at, say, to take a platform example, but not necessarily an internet example. If you look at Netflix's global strategy, it is actually around a significant degree of localization of its content as well. Whether there should be more, some would argue, but that global local dynamic is there. In terms of governance frameworks, so I think we shouldn't underestimate the extent to which global platforms actually operate in particular national and regional markets. So, but they do so being aware of how decisions in one jurisdiction can impact in another jurisdiction. So, interestingly, the in Canada, they've just adopted a news bill that's similar to the Australian News Media Bargaining Code, which was probably what Facebook feared when they blocked content. It wasn't so much the market of 25 million Australians, but the possibility of a kind of, whether you want to call it contagion or policy transfer or whatever. So at the same time, I don't think we're going to get a single global internet governance framework beyond the technical. I think the technical can happen, but once you start getting into questions around content, culture, governance frameworks, I think it's, there's one theory that I've come across that talks about 4 internets in the world: the open internet, the corporate internet, the European internet, or at least the EU's attempt to create what they call a bourgeois internet, and the Chinese internet, or an internet with standards, and the Chinese internet. You might throw the Russian internet in there as 5th one. You could actually have a lot of internets once you go down this path. But the point is, the forces towards fragmentation as well as convergence are strong.
Thank you so much, Terry. Someone else had their hand up. Yes.
Hi, Eric here. So also looking forward to reading this book. I have a question, but I'll give you the background first, or where it's coming from. So a couple of months ago, I was watching a video in Jacobin by the economist Richard Wolff, and he was talking about how successful the right wing has been globally in displacing the old debate of capital versus labor for a more contemporary debate, which is the individual versus the state. And he commended the right wing and he said, oh, they've been very successful. Now people sort of forget about the latter by focusing on the former. Now, that's a classical tension, and I'm just wondering, perhaps it comes across in the book, have you identified what are the most usual tensions in governance of tech platforms or regulation, and if those tensions reflect clearly across the political divide?
Oh, okay. Well, I think the tension between the individual and the state is not a new one, nor is that between capital and labour. Peter was probably holding forth on that at Manning Bar in 1986. But I think what's distinctive in the internet environment might be the extent to which these are recursive platforms. So, the Cambridge Analytica scandal was partly about the misuse of personal data, but the misuse of personal data happens a lot. But it was also about the extent to which a version of yourself is reflected back to you through the data that you leave traces of. And Zuboff is great on this. There's all this discussion how the Roomba's getting data on your house and, you know, all this. And then you can't, you could not tick the terms of service box, but your Roomba's not going to work if you don't. And so that's, and you know, there's debate there about whether, you know, the extent to which you get social media driven polarisation, whether that's been, you know, I think that's, yeah, I mean, there's certainly been the rise of nationalist populism, but there's also been a rise of a kind of left populism as well. So, you know, a Bernie Sanders, that was not the landscape of the US or the US Democratic Party 20 years ago. And if you look at the things Joe Biden says about platforms, it's a very different discourse to what you had during the Clinton or Obama administration. So maybe polarisation is a consequence of this, but I'm conscious of one word that I discovered during the course of writing the book. It's the Greek word akrasia. And akrasia is the, let me just check my own book to see what akrasia is. It's the kind of weakness that makes one act against one's better judgment. So it's, you know, it's the idea the internet made me do it, or Facebook made me do it, Russian trolls made me do it, or whatever it might be. So I think, you know, just as we may have been too utopian at one point, we can be too dystopian about, you know, a familiar set of debates, certainly in media studies, about the influence of.
Try one thing in really quickly though, because I think it's a great question. And I think a platform business model that looks at you as an individual consumer is not conducive to movement. And I think the left tricks itself into thinking it can micro-target itself into social movements. There's a great book I'm reading at the moment called The Quiet Before. I can't remember the author's name, but it looks at the history of movements. You need to give them space to grow. And I agree with you that I think that the polarisation around the individual versus the state is almost a natural consequence of the design of the corporate platforms.
Okay, now as a good chair, normally a very bad chair, I firstly want to thank the amazing panel. So can we just give them a round of applause, people? Incredible. And we're just going to launch Terry's book. I mean, there's so much food for thought in this room, right? And virtually, I can't even begin to scratch the surface. We could just, well, personally, I could be here for weeks discussing this, but that's a measure of. Well, let's do a reunion. Manning Bar doesn't exist anymore.
I know.
But let's move on to launching this fabulous book. Everyone, I hope, has a copy. If not, they're on sale anyway. And talk to each other afterwards, please. So, Terry, thank you for this contribution, amazing contribution to a critical debate.
All right. Hi, everybody. My name is Anika Gauja, Faculty of Arts and Social Science. And it's a real pleasure to bring this panel discussion to a close by officially launching Terry's book, Platform Regulation. I've not known Terry for as long as Peter and Kathy have, but I think Rod Tiffin is probably the common link between us in the room. Whether that's a good or a bad thing, I'll leave that to your own. Well, I think writing anything about technology and change can be really perilous because the environment in which you're writing in changes just as. But it makes it really, really important for a scholarly work such as regulating platforms to really strip back some of the noise and to concentrate on what really is the essence of the debate at hand. And I think that regulating platforms does just that. So one of the most staggering facts in this debate, this is something that Terry mentioned earlier, is just the sheer number of platforms simultaneously across the globe. And that really tells us that many people, actors and governments are struggling to understand the surrounding regulation, but they also struggle to understand some of the simplicity, the core arguments that are at the heart of the debate.
And so regulating platforms, it's a fantastic resource, and I agree with everyone on the panel who has sort of highlighted the rich detail of the book. But I also really want to laud the fact that it's an important contribution because it captures the reality of politics and power that shapes regulatory demand responses through a very sort of parsimonious framework of ideas, interests. And so you'll need to buy and to read the book to find out exactly what those ideas, interests and institutions are. But I think that just touching on that distinction that has been made tonight between regulation and governance, I think Terry really picks this up in the book. And I think it's extremely important to do that because we have seen the term governance rise to such prominence. But regulation, the way that Terry uses it, really brings politics back into the debates over governance and regulation. So reasserting the public interest in regulation, one of the central arguments that Terry makes is that public opinion is something that is really pushing, I think, the drive towards external regulation of platforms, and that nation states are becoming increasingly important actors in the online environment, which are sort of two things that, unless you have an empirical lens on what is going on, you can fail to fully comprehend. So Terry importantly urges us not to avoid jumping to conclusions about the desirability of one regulatory form over another, whether governance is preferable to regulation on the basis of idealised normative principles, most notably the desire to see an unregulated global internet, as we've heard tonight. There's no one size fits all and context matters. So Terry urges us to take an empirical approach to examining these questions, to look at the policy objectives, the measures proposed, their risks and their consequences, their effectiveness and the risks associated with their unintended consequences as well. So regulating platforms really gives us the analytical toolkit to do just that, to bring into sharp focus exactly what is at stake in this debate and how we as citizens, together with governments, can move forward in realising the regulation that is urgently needed. So with that, I congratulate Terry, wish the book well on its impact journey and officially declare Regulating Platforms launched.